Flood maps lie. I've talked about that in another video. We'll try and remember to put a link to it in the description below for those of you that are watching on YouTube. They lie. It's just part of how they're made. But there's another problem with flood maps, and that is at times, even when they're reasonably accurate, people misunderstand them, and they misunderstand the information that's shown on them. And that includes people that regulate development in the floodplain. So they misunderstand flood maps too, and that can cause major problems. So I want to tell you a story. This is a true story. It happened here at Redefined Horizons a few weeks ago. And let me tell you at the beginning of the story that I don't think the people at the public agency that I'm going to tell you about that were involved, I don't think they were evil. I don't think they were out to get me. I don't think they had malicious intent. I do think they were ignorant, and that ignorance caused some major problems for me and for my client. And so I want to tell you that story and then explain why it happened and then talk a little bit about what are the lessons that we learned from that. So in this particular story, we were working on a development in a city here in the California Central Valley. And if you're not from California, you may not know we have major flood problems in the Central Valley. It's flat. We got a lot of rivers coming down from the mountains that run through the valley, and flooding's been a major problem forever since the beginning of time. And so it's something that we deal with a lot. So in this particular development, we were building townhomes and apartments, and the developer had just finished construction on four or five townhomes, and he was trying to get his occupancy permits. And before they could get the occupancy permits, we had to go in and do what's called the post-construction elevation certificate. So that's where we go in, and I, as a surveyor, certify to the city and to FEMA that the buildings were built outside of the floodplain. And the developer, in this case, had already done quite a bit of work to make sure that the building pads were out of the floodplain, were taken out of the floodplain, and that the buildings were built outside of the floodplain. So I go ahead and I finish the elevation certificates. We send them into the city, and the official in the building department rejected my elevation certificates, and she said, I'm not going to approve these, and we're not going to issue the occupancy permits for your client because you've showed these structures as outside of the flood zone, but they're in the flood zone. So I was a little bit confused by that, so I responded to the building official, and I said, I think there's been a misunderstanding. These structures aren't in the zone. They're clearly outside of the zone. I don't understand what's going on. I need to get the certificates approved. Okay, so now before I tell you her response, let me explain a little bit about this flood zone. So the flood zone that we were adjacent to was an A zone, what they call an A zone, and it had an assigned base flood elevation. So what happened in this case, there was a creek on the south side of the property. During a flood, the water backed up against a railroad embankment, and it pooled. It spilled over onto this property, and it pooled. Okay, and we knew based on the information on the flood map approximately how high the elevation of the pool was. Okay, so we had the base flood elevation. Okay, but the actual boundary of the floodplain was wherever that elevation of the floodplain, the flood pool, intersected the existing ground. Right, that's an elevation contour that we can calculate. Okay, and so that was the real limit of the flood zone. It wasn't the line that was shown on the flood map because of the type of zone that this was. So when the building official responded to me, she sent me an email of a screenshot of her city GIS viewer, and she had overlaid the flood zone boundary on a sketch of my parcels, and she said, see, clearly these parcels are in the zone. Okay, so there were a couple problems with that interpretation of the data. Number one, she didn't understand the map scale or the level of detail in the flood map. So the thickness of the line around the flood zone boundary was 100 or 200 feet on the ground at the scale of the flood map, right? And the lots that I was dealing with, I don't even think they were 50 foot deep. These were small lots, right? So we were just arguing about a level of detail that wasn't present on the firm map at that scale. And the second problem was the location of the structures inside or outside of this particular zone was determined by the elevation of the structure, not by their horizontal location. And this building official just totally did not get that. She just totally misunderstood. All she knew is those lots showed up roughly inside that pool on the GIS viewer, and that's what she was basing her decision on. Okay, so I explained to her why that was incorrect, and I told her, hey, I'm a licensed land surveyor. I've made this determination. I believe I'm correct. You need to approve these certs. She didn't like that answer, so she sent my certs up to her boss, who was a licensed civil engineer, and he responded and told me these structures are in the zone, and we're not going to approve them and issue the occupancy permits until you change your certs, your elevation certificates. So here's what I did as a compromise. I went ahead and changed the certs, the elevation certs. I showed them as in the zone on the first sheet. But then in the comment section, I explained these structures aren't in the zone. Here's why. I think the building official and the floodplain administrator are making a mistake. And I put as much information in there as I could to try and explain the situation. Now, I don't like having to do that. I think that was a mistake. I don't think we should have showed those structures in the zone. But that was the best option I had in the circumstance. So let me explain, for those of you that regulate building and floodplains, a little bit about this type of zone, because it's a fairly common zone, this type of A zone. Okay, so in that type of A zone, the boundary of the zone is not shown accurately on the floodplain map. Okay, and there's two situations with that kind of zone where you have a pool of water like that. One is the water just fills up to the base flood elevation, and then it's going to intersect the existing ground at whatever that elevation is. And if you really want to know where the flood zone boundary is, you got to go out and do a survey and figure out where that intersection is, right? Where the floodplain intersects the existing ground, that contour. Okay, the second type of situation with this kind of zone is you have a pool like that, but it's hemmed in or it's bound by some physical features like an embankment or a wall or a levee, or just maybe a bluff. Okay, and then again, the FEMA map is not going to show the horizontal limit of that zone accurately. If you really want to know where the limit of the zone is, you got to go out and do a survey of those physical features that define the limits of the pool. So in either case, an actual survey on the ground is going to be more accurate than the information shown on the firm, on the flood map. That's why FEMA has the whole elevation certificate process to begin with, right? That's a surveyor going out to refine the information that's shown on the flood map. If the flood maps were perfect and highly accurate, you wouldn't need a surveyor to go do an elevation certificate. Okay, so what are the lessons? I think there's 3 lessons. Okay, the first lesson is for people that work at public agencies and that regulate development in the floodplain. If you are one of those people, you have a responsibility to educate yourself. You cannot be ignorant. Your decisions have consequences, right? You are either improperly putting people into a zone or you're improperly putting people out of a zone, right? And either one of those things is bad, right? We don't want to do either one of those things. We want to get the right determination. So if your agency isn't going to educate you, then you have to educate yourself. I believe that's a responsibility you have as a civil servant. If you don't do that, you're causing serious harm. Right now, in this case, my developer got his occupancy permits, but it cost us time and money because I was dealing with a building official that was ignorant and didn't know how to do their job. Okay, so you need to educate yourself. And then the other thing I would tell building officials in that situation is if you're not a licensed professional, there's nothing wrong with asking questions of the surveyor that submitted the elevation certificate, but I think you need to do that with a small dose of humility. That's a licensed professional that has made a determination based on his training or her training and experience, and I think you should respect that. I'm not saying that you can't ask questions, but you need to be very careful if you're not licensed about asking questions and arguing with a licensed professional who's made that kind of determination. If you really want to argue with the licensed professional, then I think you need to go get your own license. So then you have a right to do that. Okay, here's the second lesson. And this applies whether you're working in the public side or you're working in the private side. If you're dealing with flood hazard management, you need to be aware and understand things like map scale and level of detail. Like, to not understand those things is negligent if you are in a situation where you're trying to interpret flood maps, right? You got to understand the limitations of those maps. And you need to understand the surveyor's role in the flood insurance program, National Flood Insurance Program, and their role in preparing elevation certificates and defining the limits of flood zone boundaries. That's something that you need to know. And you have to know it, right? To not know it is negligent. And then on a related note, again, you got to be careful with those GIS mashups, man. Like, just because you've got a line in a GIS doesn't mean it's right, and it doesn't make it the gospel. You need, though, that data is only as good as the source that it came from, right? And so if you've got a flood zone boundary in a GIS, that flood zone boundary probably came from a flood map, and it has all the same limitations of the flood map and possibly more, because when you do the data translation, you're introducing error, right? So be careful with those GIS overlays. And then finally, the last lesson, and this is for developers and others that are dealing with real estate in areas where there's flood hazards, hire a good licensed surveyor to represent you. You know, you want a good surveyor on your side of the table. You want a surveyor that understands those flood hazards and understands the limitations of flood maps, and you want them there to represent you. Do not take the agency's word for it, because there's people that work in agencies that do not understand what they're doing when it comes to flood hazard management. And if you rely on their answers without an agent that represents you, it could cost you a lot of money. And so you want to avoid that mistake.